I'm Hannah Cole, 34 years old, and the night my father called me and my son dead weight, he was sitting at the head of my dining table eating food from my kitchen. My mother smiled like a hostess who'd won a prize while my brother scrolled his phone as if none of it concerned him. Eli was upstairs with his homework quiet as a held breath, and I felt the heat rise behind my ribs like a warning flare. I didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't beg. I pushed my chair back, looked my father in the eye, and told him he had 24 hours to leave my house. The room went still, the pool light outside flickering on the ceiling like slow water, and for once nobody had a comeback. That was the moment the old story cracked. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground at your own table, hit like and subscribe so we keep each other company. I grew up in a one-story house with a pecan tree out front and a mother who could make a whole room feel welcomed with a pie and a practiced smile. My father shook hands like a politician at church picnics and told neighbors that family came first, though what that meant depended on the day and who needed what. Grant, my older brother, learned early that he was made for big things. The stories at dinner always seemed to bend toward his plans, his near victories the next great idea that needed just a little more help. I learned something different. Keep the peace, clean up the mess, and try not to want much. There were no speeches about it. The rules lived in glances, in how the air turned when I asked a question that didn't flatter the room. When I was 16, I raised my grade in physics from a B to an A, and my mother patted my hand and said not to chase perfection. Not everyone was born to shine the way Grant did. The same week, he clipped a mailbox with Dad's truck and was told boys will be boys, and I watched how quickly a sentence could smooth a consequence flat. I imagined a life where effort and result had a clean line between them, and I promised myself that someday I would find that line. I kept quiet, took the extra shifts, saved what I could, and learned to be useful in ways that didn't make noise. It wasn't resentment back then, just a steady sorting of what counted and what didn't. Work became the place where the line finally held. Screens and code didn't care who you charmed. They cared if the thing ran and if it kept running at sunrise. I worked late and kept my head down, took the roles nobody fought for, and stacked small wins until they looked like a life. The first time I walked through the door of my own home, 3 bedrooms, soft light, a little pool that caught the evening and held it, I stood in the empty kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum. It sounded like a promise. I bought tall glasses that felt cool in the hand and folded napkins into neat squares, not because anyone asked me to, but because this was a place where care would finally stay where I put it. Eli arrived like a quiet tide and turned the rooms into something softer. He drew rockets on scrap paper and taped them to the fridge, lined his pencils in neat rows, and talked about the moon as if it were a porch light we could switch on. I told him the things I wished I'd heard at his age, that curiosity is not trouble, that asking is not an offense, that love has nothing to do with keeping your voice small. On late nights when the house was still, I would check on him and count the breaths between his sleeping sighs, and the future felt both fragile and possible. It mattered to me that he knew where safety lived under his own roof in his own skin. But the old rules didn't disappear just because I changed my address. The calls started the way storms move in one cloud, then another, and always with the same sky-blue tone that said, this was temporary, just a bridge, just a kindness you won't miss. A repair that cost more than expected, a payment that slipped, an opportunity that would finally take if we could all get behind it. My mother's voice would tighten by a thread when she talked about it. My father would avoid details, and Grant would be too busy to ask himself. But his plans sat in the middle of the need, like a lantern we were supposed to carry. I told myself that family first meant the help went both ways, even if it didn't look that way today. The difference between then and now arrived gradually, then all at once, like a draft that gets into the house and waits until you notice your shoulders are cold. Papers didn't appear when I asked for them. Explanations thinned out as the numbers got bigger. The tone shifted if I tried to slow the conversation down. In the office, when a deployment went sideways, we wrote everything down and fixed the cause. At home, if I asked for that same clarity, I became the problem. I started keeping my own note states, requests, what was promised and what wasn't, and tucked them into a folder that felt too heavy for what it held. It wasn't evidence at first. It was a way to hear myself think. By the time my father's words landed in my dining room, I had already felt the floorboards give under the same steps too many times. My mother had brought barbecue like it was a reunion. Grant had taken the chair with the best light and smiled into his screen. The napkins I folded lay crisp at each place like a small hope. Eli's backpack sat by the stairs, one strap twisted, a pencil peeking out, ordinary, steady, the life I built, piece by piece. My father's voice rose, and the air changed shape, and something in me didn't. I set my fork down, met his eyes, and made the sentence that held. Upstairs the floor creaked, the sound of a child listening through boards, and my mother's smile cooled by a degree. My brother lifted his head like he'd missed the first line of a show and wanted it repeated. The pool light rippled on the ceiling, turned the white paint into a moving lake, and the room measured what I would do next. Part of me hoped we would find a gentler ending, that the story might pivot if the right words were offered, papers placed on the table, truth set between us and left to stand. Instead, my mother reached for a familiar script, and my brother cleared his throat. The first threat arrived without a pause. My mother was the first to speak after I told them they had 24 hours to leave. Her voice stayed light, almost casual, like we were still sitting through a family dinner instead of standing on the edge of collapse. "Hannah, sweetheart," she said, "we didn't mean it that way. You're overreacting." Grant sighed as if I'd interrupted his thoughts, his fingers still hovering above his phone screen. My father pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping the hardwood. "You think you can talk to us like that in your own house?" he said, his tone more wounded than surprised. The silence afterward felt heavy enough to bend the walls. I didn't say another word. I gathered their plates and carried them to the sink. Behind me, my mother started whispering to Grant, and I heard the front door close a few minutes later. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house smelled faintly of barbecue and bitterness. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen counter watching the light creep through the blinds. Eli wandered in wearing his space print pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Are they gone?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "They'll be fine," I said. He didn't ask for details. He just sat beside me, his head resting on my arm, and for a few minutes we watched the steam rise from my cup like a signal we didn't have to send. It didn't take long for the phone calls to start again. First, it was my mother's name lighting up my screen mid-morning while I was reviewing code at work. I let it ring twice before answering. "Your father needs surgery," she said without preamble. "The doctor says if we don't act soon, it could be serious." Her words came fast, shaped by practiced worry. I asked where the surgery would take place, which hospital, which doctor. She hesitated, then said, "We're still getting details, but the bills are already coming in. And the house, well, we're behind again. The bank is talking foreclosure." I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of my monitor. The story sounded familiar. Big numbers, vague details, no documents. Still, I told her to bring everything to dinner that weekend. We'd talk through it, me, her dad, and Grant together. The pause on the other end lasted too long. "Of course," she said finally, though her tone told me she hadn't expected that answer. That evening, after Eli was asleep, I pulled out a yellow sticky note and started writing in neat block letters. No cash, no personal attacks. End the meeting if it turns ugly. I stuck it to the underside of my dinner plate, a small reminder that boundaries could exist on paper even when they didn't in hearts. The next day, I met Monica for coffee at our usual booth on 6th Street, near the window that caught the morning light. She twirled a pencil between her fingers as I told her about my mother's call. When I finished, she set the pencil down and gave me a look that cut straight through the noise. "They're lying," she said. I wanted to argue to believe there was still room for misunderstanding, but she shook her head. "No hospital names, no paperwork, just a number. You can't keep bleeding for people who'd let you run dry." Her words hit harder than I expected. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and waited until the sting in my eyes faded. Monica leaned closer. "If you go through with that dinner record, Texas is one-party consent. If they start twisting things again, you'll have proof." I hesitated, but she didn't blink. "Protect yourself," she said quietly. "You've spent enough years trying to protect them." By Friday, the air in the house felt different, dense waiting. I cleaned every corner that didn't need cleaning, changed the table runner twice, and set the dishes out in perfect order. 4 plates, 4 glasses, silverware aligned just so. Outside the pool, shimmered in the porch light, still as glass. Eli sat on the couch with his math homework spread across the coffee table. I knelt beside him. "You'll stay at Harper's tonight, okay? It's just a grown-up dinner." He nodded without protest, used to sudden arrangements. When he left, I felt the quiet settle deep in my chest. At 7, the knock came. My mother entered, first arms full of takeout boxes, like we were hosting a summer potluck. My father followed, moving slower than I remembered, but still holding his chin high. Grant came last, tapping on his phone, a smirk half formed on his face. They filled the room with the kind of familiarity that felt staged. My mother talked about old neighbors and her famous potato salad, her words weaving nostalgia over tension like wallpaper. I let her finish before asking, "Do you have the hospital paperwork?" "The letters from the bank." Her smile faltered. "You'll just have to trust us," she said. That word hit me harder than any accusation. Trust had been the currency of every lie. Trust us when we spent your college fund. Trust us when Grant's business collapsed. Trust us when the mortgage fell behind. Grant jumped in with his pitch before I could speak. "This new project's the real thing," he said, eyes bright. "It's augmented reality. You work in tech, Hannah. You get it. We just need a little help to launch." His tone was smooth, rehearsed, and I recognized every note of it. When I didn't answer, my father slammed his palm against the table, silverware rattling. "You make $300,000 a year, and you can't spare some for your own family." His voice filled the room. My mother's tone dropped to a whisper, meant to sound reasonable. "Think of Eli. Don't you want him to know where he comes from?" That line sliced through every defense I had left. I sat very still. "I will not mortgage my son's future to fix your mistakes," I said. Grant scoffed, leaning back. "You're playing the victim," he said. "You just got lucky. Some of us have real vision." My hands shook beneath the table, but my voice didn't. Luck didn't buy this house. Work did. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Grant's face twisted and the words spilled out before he could stop them. "Fine," he said. "Most of the debt's mine, okay? They just backed me up." My mother's eyes went cold and my father looked away. The truth landed like a dropped glass, shattering what little pretense was left. My mother leaned forward, her voice sharpening to a whisper. "If you don't help, I'll tell everyone what kind of daughter you are. I'll drag Eli into it if I have to." That was the line that changed everything. I felt something inside me harden into certainty. My voice came out steady, almost quiet. "You have 24 hours, I said again. They stared at me, mouths open but silent. My father's jaw twitched. My mother blinked as if she hadn't heard right. Grant muttered something under his breath, but I was already standing. I gathered the plates, the napkins, the forks, every piece of the evening, and stacked them in the sink. The scrape of porcelain against steel filled the space between us. When I looked up again, the 3 of them were gone. After the door closed, I turned off the lights one by one. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked. I could feel the weight of the moment settle in the air, heavy but clean. Upstairs, Eli's room was lit by a soft lamp. He was back from Harper's, sitting cross-legged on his bed, sketching a rocket ship. "Did they leave?" he asked without looking up. "Yes," I said. "For good." I paused. "We'll see." He nodded and went back to drawing his pencil, scratching across the page. I sat beside him for a while, tracing the edges of the paper where flames burst from the rocket's tail. His focus steadied me more than anything else could have. When I kissed the top of his head, my voice came out softer than I felt. "You don't have to worry. I've got us." He smiled faintly and kept drawing, and for the first time I understood that peace doesn't always arrive as relief. Sometimes it shows up as quiet resolve, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Downstairs, my phone buzzed on the counter, one new notification after another. I didn't check it right away, but the glow of the screen kept catching my eye, the light pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. By morning, the storm would already be building, the kind that doesn't start with thunder, but with a single familiar name lighting up your feed. By the time I woke the next morning, the internet had already turned my life into a spectacle. My phone blinked on the nightstand, notification after notification crowding the screen. I didn't need to open them to know what had happened. My mother had found her audience. When I finally scrolled there, she was, her hair-brushed tears tracking perfectly down her face as she spoke to the camera from her kitchen table. "Our daughter threw us out with nowhere to go," she said between practiced sobs. "We raised her, gave her everything, and now she's turned her back." She held up an old family photo, the one from my college graduation, framed in her trembling hands. The caption read, "When family forgets family." By mid-morning, the video had crossed 100,000 views. Comments poured in, some offering sympathy to her, others tearing into me. Strangers debated my character as if they'd sat at that dinner table themselves. Ungrateful, one wrote. Heartless. Another said, "Her poor father. How can she do that to her parents?" And in between them all were questions about Eli. "That boy deserves better. She's setting a bad example for her kid." Each line landed heavier than the last. At work, whispers followed me down the hallway. My coworkers glanced up from their monitors. When I passed, their smiles thin and uncertain. By lunchtime, my manager called me into his office. His tone was careful, almost apologetic. "Is everything all right at home?" he asked. "If you need time off, we can accommodate that." I kept my answers short, polite, and professional. There was nothing he could say that would help. That night, Monica didn't wait for me to call. She was already sitting in our usual booth when I arrived, her laptop open and ready. Save everything she said before I even slid into the seat. Screenshots, links, timestamps, everything. "If they want a war over your reputation, you'll fight it with proof." Her calm steadiness steadied me too. We spent hours cataloging every post, every thread, every message. I created a folder on my computer and named it Case. By the time I closed my laptop, the air in the cafe felt lighter, not because things were fixed, but because I finally had a plan. Over the next few days, the noise online only grew louder. My father sent a text that read, "You can still make this right. Just a small bridge loan to get us through." Grant started posting his own videos, rambling monologues about how I had always sabotaged his dreams. He used old photos of us as kids smiling in front of the same house he'd drained to fund his projects. My mother joined him in comments praising his resilience and hinting that I had mental health struggles. The performance was relentless. For Eli, the fallout came in quieter ways. One afternoon, he came home from school with his backpack hanging low and asked Mom, "Why does Grandma hate us?" I froze for a moment, then sat beside him at the kitchen table. "She doesn't hate you," I said carefully. "She just made choices that hurt people, and now she's trying to make those choices look smaller than they are." He nodded slowly, his eyes tired in a way I wasn't ready for. That night, I found a new drawing on the fridge, a rocket ship soaring past dark clouds. He'd written one word underneath safe. Meanwhile, the messages from my parents shifted from guilt to threat. One morning, I woke to find an email from my mother's lawyer demanding family mediation for what she called emotional damages. It was an empty gesture, but it told me what I needed to know. They weren't backing down. I sent it straight to Monica, who forwarded it to Caroline Ames, a real estate attorney she trusted. Caroline's voice on the phone was calm, measured, the kind that made you believe the floor wouldn't give way. "There's something you should see," she said. "Your parents refinanced their house 2 years ago. They're in default. Under the agreement, the bank can sell to any qualified buyer without their consent." She paused long enough for the words to settle. "If you want that property out of their hands, now's your chance." I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the backyard where Eli's basketball sat half inflated in the grass. The house my parents were losing wasn't just wood and shingles. It was where my college fund had vanished, where my father's promises had evaporated into Grant's next big idea. Taking it back wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. "Move forward," I told her. The process moved faster than I expected. Within days, Caroline had handled the paperwork, filed the offer, and closed the deal. When she called to confirm, I sat at my desk staring at the wall, too stunned to speak. "It's done," she said. "You're the legal owner now." That night, I drove to the house alone. The front lawn was overgrown, the porch light flickering. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old smoke. I walked through each room slowly, the echo of my footsteps following me down the hall. In the attic under a box of Christmas ornaments, I found an old tin chest. Inside were yellowed bank statements and my grandfather's original will, his handwriting still strong despite the shaky lines near the end. On top was a sealed envelope with my name written across it. I sat on the attic floor, the single bulb above me humming softly, and opened the letter. The money is for Hannah's education. No one else's dream, no one else's debts. The words blurred as I read them again and again. For years I'd been told that my college fund had gone to family emergencies, that it had been the fair thing to do. But here in my grandfather's neat script was proof that I hadn't imagined the betrayal. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my folder of evidence. By the time I left, the sky outside was dark, the streetlights blinking on one by one. The old house looked smaller now, stripped of the power it once had over me. I locked the door, dropped the keys in my purse, and drove home in silence. Back in West Austin, Eli was asleep when I got in. I stood by his doorway for a while, watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing. On the desk beside him was a half-finished model rocket, the pieces neatly lined up like a checklist. I thought of my grandfather's letter and the simple certainty of his handwriting. Some things are meant to build, not to borrow. Over the next week, Caroline handled the legal notices. My parents had 24 hours to vacate or face enforcement by the sheriff's department. A cease and desist went out to my mother regarding her videos. Grant responded with rage, his messages full of insults and empty threats. My father tried bargaining, offering partial repayments that never materialized. My mother posted one last video, her tone sharp and defensive, her followers cheering her on. But for the first time, their words didn't sting. I changed the locks, hired a cleaning crew, and watched the house return to quiet. The workers found more old boxes, broken gadgets, unopened mail, photo albums with missing pages. I kept only the letter. Everything else went to donation. At night, the noise online still hummed at the edges of my world, but it no longer reached me. I'd stopped checking. The comments, stopped searching my name. The folder on my computer was full, the evidence clear, the next steps already in motion. For the first time in years, I slept without waiting for the phone to ring. A few mornings later, as I poured coffee, Eli came into the kitchen holding one of his drawings. This time, it wasn't a rocket. It was a small house under a pecan tree, sunlight spilling through the branches. "I think we should plant one," he said, "in our yard." I looked at the picture for a long moment before answering. "Yeah," I said quietly. "We should." He smiled, satisfied, and went back to his breakfast. I set my cup down and let the quiet fill the room. Outside, the air was clear, the morning light soft against the windows. Somewhere in that silence, I could feel the shift, the calm before the next wave. The storm hadn't finished yet, but I was no longer afraid of it. After I bought my parents' house, the noise online began to die down, but inside I knew the quiet wouldn't last. Every time my phone buzzed, my chest tightened. My mother still had her followers, and Grant still had his temper. For a few days I waited, half expecting another ambush, another wave of humiliation. But what came next was different. It was information. Caroline called late on a Tuesday, her tone measured as always. "Everything's finalized," she said. "The property transfer is complete and they've been served notice. You're in full legal control now." I thanked her, but before she hung up, her voice softened slightly. "Be prepared, Hannah. They won't take this quietly." I stood at my kitchen window long after the call ended, watching the pool lights flicker across the water. She was right. The calm felt temporary, like the breath before a storm breaks. That night, Monica stopped by with takeout. We sat on the back porch, the smell of grilled chicken mixing with the night air. "You did what most people wouldn't have had the guts to do," she said. "But now you need to protect yourself. No more reacting. Everything from here on has to be strategic." I nodded, letting her words settle. "What do you mean by strategic?" She reached into her bag and slid a small voice recorder across the table. "Keep this close," she said. "If they show up, if they call, if they threaten you again, you record. You have the truth now. Don't let them twist it." The following morning, I organized the growing pile of documents on my desk: mortgage files, screenshots, letters, and my grandfather's note. I labeled every folder, scanned every page, and stored backups in the cloud. The work was tedious but strangely calming. It reminded me of the control I had fought so long to claim. That weekend, Eli helped me move a few boxes from the car into the guest room. Among them was a small tin box from the attic, still faintly smelling of cedar. He peeked inside and found the letter from my grandfather, its edges yellowed. "Did he write this for you?" he asked. I nodded, kneeling beside him. "A long time ago." He studied the shaky handwriting for a moment before handing it back carefully. "He sounds like he believed in you." I folded the letter and tucked it back in the box. "He did," I said quietly. The days that followed passed in uneasy stillness. My parents hadn't contacted me directly since the legal notice, but their silence had weight. When my phone finally buzzed with a new message, I hesitated before opening it. It was from Grant. "You'll regret this," the text read. "You think you're better than us, but you're nothing without family." I stared at the words, then forwarded the message to Caroline without responding. Within minutes, she replied, "Keep that. It counts as harassment." I tried to carry on with normal routines, morning runs, school drop-offs, work deadlines, but the tension hung like static. Every sound felt sharper, every shadow longer. Even Eli sensed it. One night while washing dishes beside me, he said, "It's weird not having Grandma call every day." I kept my voice steady. "We're just giving everyone some space right now." He nodded, though his eyes stayed on the soapy water. "Space is good," he said after a pause. "It's like when you back up a rocket before it launches." His words caught me off guard, simple but true. The next day, Caroline sent an update. The court had accepted our filings, setting a date to finalize the restraining order and cease and desist. I printed the email and placed it in the binder labeled Defense. Seeing the evidence stacked neatly in front of me, the videos, the texts, the will felt like armor. For so long, my family had controlled the story with volume and guilt. Now, I had proof that didn't need to shout. Late that afternoon, I found myself driving toward East Austin again. I hadn't planned to. My hands just followed the familiar route. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered. The once green lawn of my parents' house had turned brittle and brown under the summer heat. The curtains were drawn, the mailbox stuffed. For a moment, I wondered if they were still inside. Then I saw a moving truck parked a few houses down, its engine idling. A man in uniform carried boxes labeled Cole Family toward the curb. I didn't go closer. I sat in my car, engine running, and watched as the last traces of their lives there were packed away. When I got home, Eli was on the porch with his telescope adjusting its base carefully. "Look," he said, pointing toward the western sky. "You can see Venus tonight." I crouched beside him, following his finger to a bright speck near the horizon. The night was warm, the air humming with cicadas. For the first time in weeks, I felt my breath come easily. 2 days later, Caroline called again. "They've received the final order," she said. "They can't contact you outside legal channels now. If they try, the sheriff's office will handle it." I thanked her, relief and dread mixing in equal measure. The boundaries were finally written into law, but I knew boundaries don't always stop people who've made a life crossing them. That evening, I sat on the porch with Monica, sipping cold tea while the sky dimmed. She studied me for a long moment before saying, "You know this isn't over yet, right?" I nodded. "I know." She leaned back in her chair. "Then promise me one thing. When they come at you again, and they will, you don't meet them with anger. You meet them with evidence." Her words echoed in my mind later that night as I filed the last of the documents. I thought about my mother's videos, my father's accusations, Grant's texts. Every lie they told had been built on the assumption that I'd stay quiet. That was how they'd always kept me in place, using shame where proof should have been. But that version of me was gone. Before bed, I walked through the house, checking doors and lights. Eli's drawings still covered the refrigerator, and the new pecan sapling in the yard stood straight despite the heat. I paused at the window, looking out at it under the porch light. Its leaves trembled slightly in the wind, thin but holding. Somewhere between the shadows and the stillness, I realized that silence didn't scare me anymore. It wasn't a waiting room for their next attack. It was a choice I had earned. But the quiet never lasts forever. I knew another confrontation was coming, one I couldn't avoid, and this time it wouldn't happen behind closed doors. It would unfold where everyone could see who we really were. The quiet didn't last long. By Friday afternoon, my phone lit up with an unknown number. When I answered, Caroline's calm voice filled the line. "They're back in Austin," she said. "They've ignored the vacate notice." I felt the room tilt slightly. "How long have they been there?" "Since yesterday," she replied. "Neighbors reported lights on and vehicles in the driveway. I've already spoken with the bank's representative and local enforcement. You can serve them directly or let the sheriff handle it." I looked across the kitchen to where Eli sat at the table working on a school project. Small pieces of cardboard scattered like puzzle parts. "I'll handle it," I said quietly. "In person." Caroline didn't argue. "I'll meet you there," she said. "We'll do this by the book." The next morning, Austin's heat was already rising by the time I drove across town. The highway shimmered ahead of me, the same route I'd taken hundreds of times growing up, though it had never felt this long. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in the mirror, jaw tight, eyes steady. The person staring back wasn't the daughter they remembered. Caroline was waiting when I pulled into the parking lot near the terminal. She wore a navy suit despite the temperature, her hair tied back neatly, a folder tucked beneath her arm. "They're landing at gate B12, she said. "Once they're through, we serve the paperwork and step back." I nodded, my pulse quickening. Inside the airport, the air conditioning hit like a wave. Families milled around the arrival area holding flowers and balloons. A TV near the gate looped muted headlines while the smell of coffee and fried food mixed in the air. I stood near the railing, folder in hand, feeling the hum of my heartbeat in my throat. Caroline stayed beside me, calm and unshakable. Their flight arrived just after noon. Grant appeared first, striding off the jet bridge with his phone already in his hand, his expression fixed somewhere between triumph and disbelief. My mother followed, travel pillow slung over her shoulder, her face carefully arranged into weariness. My father came last, slower than I remembered, eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. My mother's expression changed instantly. She broke into a smile that didn't reach her eyes and stepped forward. "Hannah," she said, voice lilting with false relief. "Thank God you're here. We knew you'd come around." I didn't move. Caroline stepped forward and extended 3 sealed envelopes. "Robert, Linda, and Grant Cole," she said evenly. "You've been served. Please review the attached documents. Any questions can go through counsel." Grant ripped his envelope open first. As his eyes darted across the page, the color drained from his face. "You bought the house," he said, his voice rising. "You actually bought it?" "Yes." I said, my tone calm but firm. "It's mine now. You have no claim to it." Travelers began to slow as they passed, glancing curiously at the confrontation. My father's jaw clenched, his voice dropping to a growl. "You don't humiliate family in public." I met his gaze. "You did that yourselves." Grant's voice broke through again, louder this time. "You've been against me since we were kids. You can't stand to see me succeed." His words echoed through the terminal, bouncing off the tiled floor and high ceilings. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low. "You mean since you spent my college fund? Since you turned every second chance into another handout?" My mother reached for my arm, her expression tightening. "We did it for the family, Hannah. For you. Everything we've done has been to keep us together." Caroline handed my mother a copy of my grandfather's will, the one I'd found in the attic. The paper shook slightly in my mother's hand. "This was his," I said. "He left that money for my education, not your debts. You twisted his trust into your excuse." For the first time, my mother didn't have a ready answer. Her mouth opened, then closed again, eyes flicking toward the gathering crowd. My father stepped forward, voice booming. "That's enough." Caroline's tone cut clean through his. "Sir, you are now in violation of a court order. Continued contact will be considered harassment." Her composure didn't waver, not even as airport security began moving closer. Grant's anger snapped. "You'll regret this," he shouted. "You think you're better than us? You're nothing without family." I looked him in the eye and said quietly, "I already am better because I chose not to become you." The words seemed to stop him cold. He turned away, fists clenched, his face flushed red. My mother's voice softened to a pleading whisper. "Please, Hannah, don't do this. We'll lose everything." I held her gaze steady, but unmoved. "So did I years ago when you took it from me." Security stepped in then, one officer speaking calmly as Caroline explained the paperwork. They guided my parents and brother toward baggage claim. My mother turned back once, searching my face for any hint of hesitation. There wasn't any. I stood still, the folder heavy but secure in my hands. When they were gone, the noise of the terminal returned, the rolling suitcases, the chatter, the boarding announcements. I sank onto a bench, my hands trembling despite the steady rhythm of my breath. Caroline sat beside me. "You handled that exactly right," she said softly. "You were clear, calm, and on record." I nodded, though my voice wouldn't come yet. The adrenaline had drained, leaving only exhaustion in its place. Around us, people hurried past, their stories unfolding in 1,000 different directions, none of them ours. After a long moment, Caroline stood. "I'll file the confirmation with the court," she said. "They're officially notified. From here, it's enforcement and closure." I thanked her and stayed seated until the terminal emptied a little. The smell of jet fuel drifted faintly through the automatic doors, and the sun outside burned bright against the glass. As I walked back to my car, a thought came quietly but certain. This wasn't revenge, it was balance. For the first time in years, I didn't feel smaller than the people who raised me. By the time I reached home, the afternoon light had softened. Eli was on the couch working on a science project, bits of foam board and wire scattered around him. He looked up when I walked in. "Everything okay?" he asked. I smiled, setting my keys down. "Yeah," I said. "It will be." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his work. From the window, I could see the young pecan tree we'd planted, its thin trunk bending slightly in the breeze. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty anymore. Later that night, I stood on the porch, phone in hand. A single new notification blinked on the screen, another post from my mother. The caption read simply, "Sometimes the truth hurts. No tears this time, no performance." I didn't open it. Instead, I locked my phone and turned off the porch light. For the first time in a long while, I slept through the night without waking. But peace, I learned, rarely comes without an echo. By morning, messages were already piling up again, new stories, new angles, and one headline that would shift everything all over again. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, but the house already felt different. I brewed coffee and scrolled through my phone, expecting silence. Instead, my screen lit up with alerts, articles, screenshots, and messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. My mother's newest video had gone viral overnight. This time she wasn't crying. She sat in front of a bookshelf, her hair pulled back neatly, her voice steady. "I made mistakes," she said, "but I was manipulated. My son Grant has used me and his father for years. I let him drag me into his mess." The words sounded practiced, rehearsed for sympathy. Below the video, her followers argued over who was telling the truth. The comments swung from pity to disbelief. I watched the clip twice, not because I doubted what I heard, but because I couldn't recognize her anymore. The woman who had once defended Grant at all costs was now trying to rewrite the story midstream. I set the phone down and stared out the window at the young pecan tree in the yard. Its branches trembled in the breeze, fragile but holding steady. By evening, Grant's posts began to surface. He looked nothing like the confident man from the airport. His hair was unkempt, his eyes hollow. "They ruined me," he said into the camera. "My sister stole my shot at redemption. She took everything." The video was a mixture of anger and desperation, jumping between self-pity and rage. Within hours, it had hundreds of comments. People were beginning to see through the act. That week, Caroline called with an update. "The court date's been moved up," she said. "The judge has everything your grandfather's will, the refinance documents, the harassment record. This should close quickly." Her voice was calm, but the words carried a weight I could feel in my chest. I thanked her and hung up, leaning against the counter. When the day arrived, I wore a simple navy dress, nothing that drew attention. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Caroline met me in the hallway with her usual quiet focus, her briefcase balanced on one arm. "They're here," she said softly. "Let's keep it civil." Inside the courtroom, my parents sat together in the front row, their faces drawn tight. Grant sat behind them, his expression unreadable. The judge flipped through the files, his glasses low on his nose. Caroline presented each document in calm sequence: the will, the text messages, the property deed, the cease and desist. There was no room for doubt. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was measured and final. The property remains with Ms. Cole. All other claims are denied. Further harassment will result in legal penalties. My mother's shoulders sagged. My father's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Grant slumped forward, staring at the floor. It was done. No applause, no satisfaction, just silence that carried the sound of an ending. Outside, the sun was bright, the air thick with summer heat. Caroline closed her briefcase and smiled faintly. "It's over," she said. "At least the part that matters on paper." I nodded, though the words took a moment to land. That afternoon, I returned to the East Austin house one last time. The cleaning crew had finished their work and the room stood bare. Dust motes floated in the light coming through the windows. On the mantel, a single photograph remained me and Grant as children holding sparklers in the backyard. I picked it up, studied the faces, then placed it gently in a box marked "Donate." When I stepped outside, the air smelled faintly of cut grass and rain. I locked the door and handed the keys to Caroline. "Sell it," I said. "Whatever it brings, put it toward closing costs." She nodded, understanding that it wasn't about money anymore. Back home, Eli was waiting at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of lemonade and a grin that told me he'd been watching for my car. "Did it go okay?" he asked. I nodded. "It's all settled." He handed me one of the glasses. "Good," he said. "Now we can build the treehouse." We spent that weekend in the backyard, measuring boards and marking cuts with chalk. The pecan tree wasn't tall yet, but Eli insisted it would grow fast. We built a small platform between the thicker branches and painted it a soft shade of blue. Each nail we drove felt like a promise that this house, this yard, would stay ours. When the last board was secured, Eli climbed up and waved from the platform. "It's not high, but it's strong," he said. I smiled, shading my eyes from the sun. "That's all that matters." Weeks passed and life began to settle. The noise online faded as quickly as it had started. My mother's followers moved on to new stories. Grant disappeared from social media entirely. My father's number stopped showing up on my phone. The silence that once felt heavy now carried peace. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the county clerk confirming the case closure. I placed it in a small fireproof box along with my grandfather's will and Eli's first drawing of the house. These were the pieces of truth I intended to keep. Later that evening, Monica came over with dinner. We sat on the porch, the cicadas humming as the sun dipped low. "You know," she said between bites, "you could turn this into something more, helping people who go through this kind of thing. Legal aid advocacy, something that fits you." I didn't answer right away. The idea lingered long after she left. That night, after tucking Eli into bed, I stood in his doorway for a while. He'd fallen asleep with a pencil still in his hand, a new drawing half finished on the desk beside him. It showed our little house under a wide sky, a tree house perched in the branches and 2 stick figures waving below. In the corner he'd written one word, "Home." I turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like a pause before trouble. It felt like the space where something new could begin. Outside, the tree stood tall against the night sky, its young leaves catching the breeze. I knew storms would come again. Life always finds ways to test what we build, but now I also knew what strength looked like. It wasn't loud or angry or desperate to prove a point. It was steady-rooted and patient. And though I didn't know what the next chapter would bring, I was finally ready for it. The following morning, as I poured coffee, a new message appeared on my phone. The sender's name stopped me cold, Linda Cole. The subject line read, "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring slightly on the screen before setting the phone down beside my cup. Outside, the pecan tree shimmered in the early light, and I understood some reckonings don't end with a verdict. Some begin with silence. The email from my mother stayed unopened for 2 days. I saw it every time I checked my phone, her name hovering at the top of my inbox like a ghost I wasn't ready to face. On the 3rd morning, I poured coffee, sat at the kitchen counter, and tapped it open. The message was short, written without her usual flourishes. "We need to talk. It's not about money. Please meet me. Mom." For a long time I stared at the screen, half expecting another twist, another performance. But the tone was different this time, flat, almost tired. Against my better judgment, I replied with a single line, "Tomorrow at noon, public place." I chose a small cafe near the courthouse, quiet on weekdays. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair had more gray, her eyes dull from sleeplessness. For the first time in years, she didn't start with an apology or a demand. "I don't know where to begin," she said softly. "Maybe with Grant." I waited. "He's gone," she continued. "Packed what was left of his things and disappeared. He blocked our numbers. Your father blames me, and maybe he's right." Her voice trembled, not with guilt, but exhaustion. I folded my hands on the table. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. I made a mess of everything she said. I thought I could fix him if I just helped one more time. But every time I tried to save him, I sank with him. I dragged everyone else down too. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the espresso machine filled the silence between us. Then she reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, a typed statement of retraction addressed to the same social media accounts she'd used to post her accusations. "I already sent it," she said. "The truth. That we lied. That we hurt you. It's public now. I don't expect forgiveness. I just couldn't keep pretending." Her words hung in the air, heavy but strangely calm. I set the envelope down and looked at her. "What about Dad?" Her expression hardened. "He doesn't speak to me anymore. Said I betrayed the family by admitting anything. He moved in with his cousin in Waco." She gave a bitter laugh. "Maybe distance will do him some good." I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of years settle somewhere deep in my chest. "Mom," I said quietly, "you can't fix the past with a post, but maybe you can stop adding to it." She nodded, eyes down. "I know." The conversation drifted after that, updates about neighbors, the weather small talk meant to patch cracks that were too wide to close. When I finally stood to leave, she reached out and touched my wrist. "You were right to cut us off," she said. It was the only thing that made me see what I'd become. I didn't answer. I just nodded and walked out into the Texas heat. The air smelled like rain again, even though the sky was still clear. That evening I told Monica about the meeting over dinner. She listened quietly, her fork resting against her plate. "Do you believe her?" she asked finally. "I think she believes herself," I said. "That's enough for now." Monica gave a slow nod. "You know you don't have to keep carrying their story. You already wrote your own ending." The next week, the official retraction from my mother spread online. The comments were quieter this time, mostly strangers offering support or confusion. Grant's old videos disappeared from his page, and for once my name wasn't attached to their chaos. Then came a letter from Caroline confirming the court's final order, restraining measures upheld, property secured, no appeals filed. The case was closed in full. Reading it felt like closing a door that had stood open too long. With each passing day, the rhythm of our lives settled back into place. Mornings with coffee and quiet. Afternoons filled with Eli's laughter echoing through the house. He'd started sketching new designs for his treehouse pages of ideas taped to the wall near his desk. One evening, as the light faded, he looked up from his drawing and said, "Can we make it bigger someday?" I smiled. "We'll see. Maybe when the tree's ready." That same week, I got an email from a local journalist. She'd seen the public records of my case and wanted to write about it, not the scandal, but the process. "There are others going through similar family disputes," she wrote. "Your story could help them understand their rights." I hesitated for days before responding. Sharing my story publicly again felt risky, but Monica reminded me, if you don't tell it, someone else will, and they'll get it wrong. So I agreed. The interview took place at my home a quiet Sunday morning while Eli played in the yard. The journalist, a kind woman named Rachel Porter, sat across from me at the kitchen table recorder between us. She didn't ask for gossip or emotion. She asked for steps, how I documented everything, how I handled the paperwork, how I kept records, even when no one believed me. People need to hear that truth isn't always loud, she said. When the article went live, it wasn't sensational. The headline was simple: Austin mother reclaims home and boundaries through evidence, not anger. It spread quietly, shared among women's groups and legal circles. Messages began to trickle into my inbox, thank yous from people who'd faced their own versions of the same story. Daughters, sons, even parents who'd chosen distance over destruction. That night, I sat on the porch with Monica scrolling through the messages while cicadas buzzed in the dark. She smiled over the rim of her glass. "See," she said, "you didn't just survive it, you built something from it." I looked out at the yard where Eli's treehouse stood, the small platform now surrounded by growing leaves. Maybe, I said, maybe it's time to make it bigger. When I tucked Eli into bed later, he pulled a new drawing from under his pillow. It showed the treehouse again, but this time there were two figures, him and me holding paintbrushes, the branches stretching high above us. At the bottom, he'd written, "Me and Mom, builders." I kissed his forehead and turned off the light. In the hallway, the house was still and warm. For once, the silence didn't carry any shadows. Outside, the pecan tree swayed gently under the porch light, its leaves whispering against the night air. I thought of my mother's tired voice, my father's anger, Grant's disappearance, and how the noise had finally faded into distance. But this ending didn't feel like revenge. It felt like recovery. What came next wasn't about them anymore. The next morning, I woke to an email notification, this time from the editor of a women's advocacy group. They wanted me to speak at a community forum about setting boundaries, sharing resources, and breaking family cycles. I read it twice before forwarding it to Monica with a single line. "Think I should." Her reply came a minute later. "Yes, it's what you were built for." I looked out the window at the pecan tree glowing in the morning sun. The branches were fuller than I remembered, the young leaves strong enough to hold their shape in the wind, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't just feel free, I felt ready. The morning of the community forum arrived clear and bright, the kind of day that carried a quiet sense of possibility. I dressed simply, a navy blouse and jeans, and packed a folder of notes I probably wouldn't use. Monica met me at the entrance to the Civic Center, coffee in hand, her usual steady smile easing the tension in my shoulders. "You're not here to perform," she reminded me. "You're here to tell the truth." Inside, the room filled slowly, retirees' parents, a few younger faces scattered among them. At the front, a modest banner read, "Voices of Renewal Healing Through Boundaries." Rachel Porter stood near the podium, organizing papers, and waved when she saw me. "We'll keep it simple," she said. "Just share what helped you hold steady when things got loud." When my turn came, I stepped up to the microphone. My hands didn't shake. I talked about the quiet kind of strength, the kind that builds slowly through small acts of self-respect. I told them about documentation patience and the way truth sometimes hides behind paperwork and persistence. I mentioned Caroline's calm guidance, Monica's loyalty, and Eli's drawings that reminded me what I was protecting. I didn't name my parents or brother. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about reclaiming peace. When I finished, the room stayed silent for a moment before gentle applause began, steady and sincere. A woman near the back dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Another approached afterward, thanking me for putting words to something she'd lived through but never spoken aloud. Her hand trembled slightly when she said, "I thought walking away made me weak. You made me realize it didn't." That night after the forum, I came home to find Eli asleep on the couch, his backpack open beside him. A new drawing lay on atop our little blue treehouse, now surrounded by stars, a rocket lifting from its roof. He'd written in small, careful letters, "Go higher, Mom." I sat beside him for a while, watching the rise and fall of his breathing, the soft glow of the lamp catching the edges of his curls. The weeks that followed felt lighter. My mother kept her distance, but occasionally sent brief updates, small things polite and cautious. My father stayed silent, and that silence finally didn't ache. I heard nothing more of Grant, only rumors that he'd left the state. Each absence felt less like loss and more like space reclaimed. Caroline called one afternoon to say the house sale had closed. The funds covered all remaining legal fees, and there was even a small amount left over. I told her to donate it to a local shelter that helped single parents get back on their feet. She hesitated for a second, then said, "That feels like the right ending." Summer deepened. The pecan tree grew thicker, its leaves dense enough now to shade the new swing Eli and I had hung from one of its branches. Some evenings we sat out there until dusk, the air warm and still, the sound of crickets filling the spaces where conflict used to live. One night as we watched the stars blink through the dark, Eli said quietly, "You don't talk about Grandma or Grandpa much anymore." I looked up at the sky before answering. "Some things get lighter when you stop carrying them," I said. He nodded thoughtfully, swinging gently back and forth. In the distance, a storm flickered along the horizon, soft thunder rolling across the open sky. It reminded me that peace doesn't mean the world stops shaking. It just means you've built something strong enough to stand in it. The article Rachel wrote about the forum came out a week later. She titled it, "Boundaries as Inheritance." The last line stayed with me. Sometimes the most powerful legacy we pass on isn't wealth or approval. It's the courage to start over. I clipped the piece and tucked it into the same fireproof box that held my grandfather's letter and the final court order. Proof not of the fight, but of the freedom that followed. Life began to move forward in quiet, ordinary ways. I planted a few herbs by the kitchen window, started running again, signed Eli up for summer science camp. The house, once a place of tension, became a home again, filled with laughter music and the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. Sometimes, I still thought about the people my parents used to be before pride hardened them. I hoped they'd each find their own peace someday, even if it never crossed paths with mine. Forgiveness, I'd learned, didn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it just meant releasing the need to explain yourself one more time. Now, when I look at that pecan tree stretching tall outside our window, I think of everything it took to plant it, every broken branch that led to that small, stubborn sprout. The roots dug deep, the branches reaching wide, neither ashamed of how long it took to grow. That's what healing feels like. Not sudden, not loud, but steady. A life rebuilt one choice at a time, anchored in truth. So if you're listening to this and carrying your own version of that weight, someone else's expectations, guilt, or silence, remember this. You are allowed to start over. You are allowed to draw the line and still love from a distance. And when you finally find your peace, hold it gently but don't hide it. Share it. You never know who might need to hear that it's possible. If this story reached you, take a moment to breathe, reflect, or even share your own. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stay close. Sometimes the hardest endings lead us exactly where we're meant to begin again.